Sometimes, a simple knock on a door can unravel a story you never thought you'd be part of. I was just there to deliver groceries another day, another address, but when she opened the door and asked me not to leave, I had no idea it would be the start of something that would quietly reshape us both. I didn't know how long I'd stay that afternoon, or how much of myself I'd find in someone I'd never met before. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. It started on a windy Thursday morning in late March, the kind where the sky can't decide between rain or sunlight. I had been working for an independent grocery delivery service in the quieter neighborhoods just outside of Raleigh. It wasn't my dream job, not even close, but it helped me pay the bills and gave me something to do after my life had taken a few turns I hadn't exactly planned for. I'd gotten used to the routine. Pick up the list, load up the car, knock, deliver, smile, and repeat. Most people barely said more than a few words. Some didn't even bother to open the door, just shouted thanks through it. I wasn't expecting anything different when I pulled into the gravel driveway of a small, one-story home with ivy creeping up the sides and a sun-faded wreath still hanging on the front door. The name on the delivery slip was Madeline Warren. The order was some almond milk, frozen blueberries, tea bags, and a couple of boxes of granola. Nothing unusual. I knocked, waited, then knocked again. When the door opened, I was met by a woman in her early 50s, tall and thin, with warm but tired eyes that looked like they hadn't seen a visitor in a while. She had a blanket draped loosely over her shoulders and a slight limp when she moved toward me. I offered her the bags and she paused, just for a second, longer than normal, as if measuring whether she wanted to accept the groceries or start a conversation. That second stretched into an awkward silence. I asked if she wanted me to set them inside for her, and she nodded not a word. Just a nod, and stepped aside. Her house smelled like cinnamon, and something older, like forgotten paperbacks and quiet mornings. I placed the bags on the counter and turned to leave, but then I heard her voice behind me, quiet but firm. "Don't leave," she said. "I'm not joking." I turned around, unsure if she meant it literally or if it was a poor attempt at humor. But she looked at me, not with desperation, but with a kind of strange seriousness, like someone who'd finally decided to speak after being silent too long. I stood there, half in, half out, and asked her if everything was all right. She didn't answer right away, just gestured toward the kitchen table. I took it as a sign that maybe she wasn't. All right, after all, she moved slowly to sit, her hand brushing over the back of the chair like it was something she needed to steady herself. I sat across from her. Still, she didn't say much. She didn't even look at me, just started unpacking the groceries right there at the table like we were sharing a task. She offered me tea, which I declined out of habit, and she poured herself a cup anyway. I remember noticing how the spoon clicked against the porcelain cup like a metronome counting the seconds. We sat in near silence for several minutes, interrupted only by the occasional creak of her wooden floor or the wind rustling through the thin curtains. Eventually, she told me her name. I told her mine. I said I'd only be staying a few minutes, but something in the way she held her shoulders made me linger. She asked me what I did before deliveries. I told her I used to work in auto repair until I had to take a step back to help take care of my father who had a stroke last year. Nodded like she understood more than she was letting on, and then she shared something smaller, passing comment about how this used to be her mother's house, how she had moved back in a few years ago and never quite got around to leaving, that she didn't get many visitors these days. I could feel the heaviness of her words, even though she was trying to be casual. She wasn't trying to make me feel guilty or obligated to stay, but there was a quiet invitation in the way she spoke, an unspoken ask for company without the awkwardness of saying it aloud. I wasn't sure what made me stay. Maybe I felt sorry. For her, maybe I was just tired of rushing through life for once. Maybe I knew that feeling of being invisible all too well. But when I finally stood to go, she looked up and said again, this time softer, "Don't leave. I'm not joking." And that was when it hit MIT wasn't about the groceries. It never was. I told her I had one more delivery to make and that I'd be back in 30 minutes if she wanted. She just nodded, as if she wasn't sure I meant it. I wasn't either, but 30 minutes later, I was back, with 2 cups of coffee from a drive-thru and a weird feeling in my chest I hadn't expected. The second time felt different. I had stepped into a room I didn't know I missed until I was standing inside of it. She smiled when she saw the coffee and said she preferred tea, but took it anyway. That day turned into a couple of hours. The next delivery turned into another visit. And before I knew it, I was coming by even when she hadn't ordered anything. We talked more. Not all at once, not everything deep, but enough. Enough to know that she used to teach English lit at a community college before she burned out and left mid-semester. Enough to know that her brother lived 2 states away and only called on birthdays. Enough to realize she wasn't fragile, just tired. Like she'd been carrying something too heavy for too long and hadn't found anyone she trusted enough to help carry it. I didn't ask her what she meant by "don't leave that first day." Not yet. But I knew it wasn't just about needing help unpacking a bag of groceries. It was about something much quieter, something I was only beginning to understand. Left that day with more questions than answers and a strange ache in my chest, the kind you get when something is just starting to mean something to you, even though you're afraid to name it. I didn't tell anyone about Madeline at first. Not my roommate back at the shared rental I'd been crashing in since I left my dad's place. Not the guys at work who teased me about getting too friendly with customers. Definitely not my mom, who would have read way too much into it. It felt like something I needed to keep close to my chest. Like a fragile shell you find on the beach, something beautiful, but easily broken if too many hands touched it. I just kept showing up, sometimes with a bag of coffee or a new brand of granola she hadn't tried, sometimes with nothing at all. It wasn't about the food anymore, and we both knew it. The third time I visited, she answered the door wearing a light blue sweater that looked like it had seen better winters. Her hair tied up in a loose bun that somehow made her seem softer than usual. She looked at me like I was early, or maybe like she wasn't sure I'd really come back again. I wasn't sure either. But her smiles, small, polite, tired, made something in me want to keep returning just to see it shift into something warmer. She didn't ask why I came. She didn't need to. She just stepped aside and let me in like I was a friend dropping by. It's not a stranger who used to ring the bell and stand awkwardly on her porch. That day she talked about her garden, or what was left of it. She used to grow herbs and tomatoes in raised beds out back, but a rough storm last year had ripped the lattice to shreds and washed out most of the soil. She said she kept meaning to rebuild it, but there was always something: fatigue, her knee acting up, the weather not cooperating. I asked if I could take a look. She hesitated, then agreed, watching me from the back door as I walked out into the overgrown patch that used to be her pride. The wood planks were still there, warped and faded, but salvageable. I told her so, and she just nodded, sipping her tea, as if to mask the way her eyes lit up for a second. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Back to the story. We didn't talk about big things that day. No childhood confessions or broken heart stories. Just the garden, the state of her leaky faucet, and how she missed the sound of rain on her old metal awning that had been replaced with quieter shingles. But it wasn't what we talked about that stuck with me. It was how it felt. Like being needed in a way that didn't scream or beg, just existed quietly, waiting for someone to notice. I think that's what drew me in, the fact that nothing about her demanded attention. And yet everything about her held it once you looked close enough the following week. I started making a habit of stopping by every few days, sometimes under the excuse of checking on her garden plan, other times just because I happened to be driving through her street. I began recognizing the things that made her house feel lived in: the ticking clock above the kitchen sink, the faint smell of peppermint oil she kept dabbing under the windows to keep spiders away, the stack of old newspapers she said she'd read someday, but never did. She wasn't lonely in the desperate, sad kind of way. It was more like a soft loneliness, the kind you wear like an old cardigan, not exactly comfortable, but familiar enough that you forget it's there. One afternoon, I brought her a box of lemon muffins from a cafe I passed on the way. She smiled when she saw them, said they reminded her of the ones her mother used to make. She took one, broke it in half, and handed me the other piece without. saying anything. Sat in the kitchen, not even pretending to do anything else, sharing a muffin and looking out the window at a sky that couldn't decide if it wanted to rain. It was the kind of silence that didn't feel empty. I started noticing little things. How she'd begun combing her hair more neatly on the days I came over, or how she'd light a candle by the sink that filled the room with the smell of baked apples. I never said anything about it, didn't need to, but I noticed. I also noticed that she kept the second chair at the table pulled out now, like she was expecting someone, like she'd started to believe I might actually keep coming back. One day, she mentioned her late husband, not in a heavy way, just casually, like a detail that slipped out. Said his name was Marcus, that he used to play the piano in the evenings, and made a mess of the kitchen every time he tried to cook, that he'd passed away 6 years ago and she hadn't realized how quiet a house could become until there was no music in it. She didn't cry, didn't tremble, just stared at her cup of tea like it might still give her warmth. I didn't know what to say. I'm not good with grief, not mine, not anyone else's, but I stayed. I felt like the most honest thing I could do. As the days stretched into weeks, something about our visits began to settle into a rhythm. I would knock, she would open the door with that same half-surprised look, and we'd ease into the afternoon like two people rehearsing an old play. She started asking me questions about my life, my family, my ex. I told her about the mechanic shop I used to work at, how I left because I couldn't juggle everything after my dad's stroke, how I felt stuck sometimes, like I was living life on pause. She listened without offering advice or pity, just listened. And somehow, that made it easier to keep talking. Then one day she asked me if I ever got tired of being invisible. I didn't understand at first. She explained how growing older made her feel like she was disappearing, like she was becoming background noise in her own life. I told her I sometimes felt the same way, not because of age, but because of how life just piled on top of itself jobs. Caretaking, loneliness that got mistaken for independence. It was the first time I saw something flicker in her eyes, like recognition, like I had finally stepped into the same quiet room she'd been living in for years. It was also the first time I stayed past sundown. She offered me dinner, nothing fancy, just grilled cheese and tomato soup, and I accepted without hesitation. The house looked different in the evening light, softer, warmer, like it had finally exhaled. We sat at the table, the TV playing, something forgettable in the background, and we ate like we'd done it 100 times before. When I left that night, she didn't say don't leave, but the silence between us said she still meant it. The next time I visited, the air felt heavier than usual, like something unspoken had been waiting between us and was now starting to grow roots. It had been 4 days since my last stop at Madeline's house, not because I didn't want to see her, but because life, as it always does, pulled me in a dozen directions. Work had been chaotic, my car had been giving me issues, and I'd spent an entire afternoon arguing with the billing office over some paperwork related to my dad's physical therapy. But despite all that noise, she stayed in the back of my mind, like a soft melody I couldn't shake off. I told myself I was just being polite, that I was keeping a promise to an older woman who seemed lonely, but deep down, I knew better. This wasn't about courtesy anymore. This was about her, about how she made the quiet feel less empty. When I knocked that afternoon, the door opened slower than usual. Madeline stood there in a thick sweater and wool socks, her face a little paler, her hair not brushed back like she usually had it. She didn't say anything at first, just stepped aside and let me in. The air inside the house was unusually still, like even the walls were holding their breath. I asked if everything was all right, and she gave me the kind of answer people give when they don't want to lie but can't quite tell the truth. She said she was just tired, that her knee had been bothering her and the weather always made her joints ache. I nodded, not wanting to press. But I could see it in her posture. Something was off. She sat at the table without, not offering tea or muffins or any of the little rituals we had grown into. I joined her, unsure what to say. I had grown used to her. Quiet, but this silence was different. This one felt like a wall instead of an invitation. I asked again if she was okay, softer this time. She finally looked at me, and there was something in her expression I hadn't seen before. Not sadness, not fear. Something heavier, like the weight of being reminded how alone you really are. Even when someone is sitting across from you, she told me she'd had a bad night, that the storm the night before had shaken her awake and she couldn't fall back asleep. That she'd started thinking about Marcus again and the way he used to hum in the middle of the night when he thought she was asleep. She said she missed that sound, missed the way the house used to feel full, even when they weren't talking. Now, it just echoed. She didn't cry, she didn't tremble. But the pain was there, plain and simple, laid out in her voice like a table. Already set for grief, I didn't know what to do with that kind of vulnerability. I'm not the guy people pour their hearts out to. I fix things. I lift heavy boxes, fill the silence with tasks and jokes and empty distractions. But Madeline didn't need a distraction. She needed someone to see her, to sit in the stillness with her and not look away. So I stayed. I asked if she wanted me to help with anything around the house, and for the first time, she said yes. We spent the next hour in the backyard, clearing fallen branches and scooping out soggy leaves from the gutters. I worked while she sat on the old bench near the fence, a blanket draped over her shoulders, offering occasional commentary or stories from when her mother still kept roses by the lattice. She talked more out there than she had inside, and I realized she wasn't just tired of being alone. She was tired of being indoors, being surrounded by memories she couldn't escape. The yard gave her a little breathing room, a little distance from the ghosts inside. When I finished, she handed me a towel for my muddy hands and thanked me without saying the word thanks. It was in her eyes, the way she lingered as I stood up and wiped the dirt off my jeans. She asked if I wanted to stay for dinner again. I said yes before she finished the sentence. This time, it wasn't soup and grilled cheese. It was pasta and garlic bread and the closest thing I'd had to a home-cooked meal in months. She laughed when I complimented her cooking, saying it was just frozen sauce and store-bought breadsticks. But I didn't care. It wasn't about the food. It was the way she moved around the kitchen with intention again, like she was hosting, like she was reclaiming something. That night, we didn't sit in silence. We talked, really talked. She asked me about my dad, and I told her the truth, that some days I resented him for needing so much from me, and other days I felt guilty for thinking that. I told her I wasn't sure I was doing anything right, that I felt like I was barely holding my life together. She didn't offer solutions. She just listened. When I asked her what she regretted most, she said it wasn't anything grand. It was all the small things. The quiet decisions. The way she stopped playing music after Marcus died. The way she let years pass without painting the hallway like she'd always meant to. The way she stopped answering the phone even when people were still calling. She said, she didn't mean to close the world out. It just happened. One day of quiet turned into a week, then a month, then a year. Before she knew it, the silence had become normal, comfortable even, till I showed up with a bag of groceries and ruined. She said that last part with a half smile, and I smiled back, not sure if I should apologize or thank her for letting me in, maybe both. As I got ready to leave, she walked me to the door like she always did, but this time she stood there a little longer. The hallway light caught the silver strands in her hair and the fine lines around her eyes. And I remember thinking how strong she looked in that moment, not despite everything, but because of it. She opened the door, but didn't step aside. She looked at me, held my gaze, and for a second I thought she was going to say it again. Don't leave. But she didn't. She just said, be careful driving home, like it meant more than just road conditions. I drove home in silence, my hands loose on the wheel, my thoughts circling back to her, to the way she laughed at herself, to the way she folded her napkin 3 times before setting it down, to the way her voice sounded when she said my name. Something was changing, slow and steady. Like the way seasons shift without you noticing until suddenly the air smells different. I didn't know what it meant yet, didn't even know what I wanted it to mean, but I knew I'd be back, not because she needed me, but because something about being with her made me feel less invisible, like maybe I wasn't drifting anymore. Like maybe, for the first time in a long time, I was exactly where I was supposed to be. A few mornings after that quiet dinner, I woke up earlier than usual with the urge to check in on Madeline. I didn't have a delivery scheduled in her neighborhood that day, but something about the rhythm we'd fallen into made it feel strange not to see her. I hadn't told her I'd be stopping by, and I debated whether it might be too forward. But my gut told me it wasn't about errands or groceries anymore. Something was shifting, not just between us, but inside me. And when I found myself picking up a loaf of sourdough and her favorite lemon tea from the store without even thinking about it, I realized I was no longer visiting her life. I was becoming part of it. Her house was quiet when I pulled up. The porch light was off, and the curtains were still drawn, even though the sun was already stretching across the trees. I hesitated before knocking, wondering if she was still asleep, but the moment my knuckles hit the door, I heard the familiar shuffle of her steps. She opened it wearing a long cardigan over pajama pants, her expression caught between surprise and relief. She didn't question why I was there or scold me for coming unannounced. She just stepped back and said, "Come." And there was something raw in her that morning, not broken, not sad, just unfiltered. Like I was seeing her without the usual buffer of polite conversation or habitual distance. Her hair was messy, there was no trace of lipstick, and she hadn't even put water on for tea yet. I handed her the small bag I brought, and she smiled faintly as she reached inside. "You remembered the lemon tea," she said, almost under her breath, like it surprised her more than it should have. I shrugged and told her it was just a lucky guess, but it wasn't luck. I remembered because I cared. We ended up sitting on the living room couch instead of the kitchen that morning, and it felt like a shift in the atmosphere. More personal, more familiar. The television was on, but muted, showing a local news station scrolling headlines we didn't read. She curled up on one end of the couch with her tea, and I took the other side, still feeling like a guest, but less like a stranger. The room was filled with that soft kind of silence that lets you breathe without having to fill every space with words. After a while, she glanced at me and asked if I ever got scared of growing older. I didn't know how to answer her at first. No one had ever asked me that, not in a real way, not in a way that mattered. I told her the truth, that I wasn't afraid of getting older, but I was afraid of ending up alone. I said I worried that I'd wake up one day and not recognize my life or the person I had become, that maybe I was just passing time rather than building something meaningful. She nodded slowly, like each word I spoke was one she'd already thought herself 1,000 times. She said that fear had crept up on her too, that it started quietly when the dinner table had only one plate on it. When the house echoed with every step, when no one asked her how her day had been, she didn't say it with bitterness. She said it like a fact. It's like something you eventually learn to accept, even if you don't want to. That day we talked more than usual. She opened up about her years teaching, how she loved it until the system burned her out. She said she missed the curiosity of students, the way their eyes lit up when they understood something for the first time. But over time it became more about paperwork and politics than learning, and she lost the spark. She said Marcus used to tell her to quit long before she actually did, but she kept pushing herself because she thought walking away meant failure. It wasn't until he passed that she realized the real failure was staying in a life that didn't feed her anymore. I listened, not as someone passing time, but as someone who was finally beginning to understand that people aren't defined by their routines. They're defined by the parts of themselves they fight to keep alive. Later that afternoon, I helped her bring a box of old books down from the attic. She had mentioned them in passing, how they'd just been collecting dust, how she wanted to go through them, but her knee made the ladder too risky. I offered without hesitation, and she didn't argue. The attic was cramped and smelled like cedar and thyme, filled with cardboard memories and forgotten seasons. As I handed the box down to her, she brushed the cover of one old paperback and smiled like she was seeing an old friend. She said she used to read poetry out loud to Marcus before bed, even when he was too tired to respond. She said she didn't do that anymore, not since the house became hers alone. Back downstairs, she placed the box on the table and started thumbing through the pages. I sat beside her, watching the way her fingers lingered on certain titles. She read me a few lines from a bookmarked page, something about love not being loud but steady, not grand but constant. Her voice cracked just slightly as she read, but she kept going, and I sat there in silence, letting the words fill the room like sunlight. I hadn't realized how much I missed hearing poetry spoken aloud until that moment. She closed the book and said she'd forgotten how much she loved it. I told her she should start reading again. She smiled and said maybe, now that someone would listen, as the sun began to dip low. Casting warm shadows across the wooden floor, I helped her put the books on a nearby shelf. The afternoon had slipped away without us noticing, and the air had that sleepy golden quality that only comes just before dusk. She walked me to the door like always, but this time there was a hesitation in her steps. She leaned lightly against the frame, her tea now cold in her hand, and looked up at me like she was weighing something in her mind. I waited, unsure what she might say. She didn't say it, not then. But the look in her eyes said everything. Stay, don't leave. Not yet. I told her I'd see her soon, and she nodded. As I walked back to my car, I glanced over my shoulder, and she was still standing there, one hand resting against the doorframe, watching me like I was something rare. I didn't sleep much that night. My mind kept circling back to her, to that room filled with old books and tea and silence that somehow made me feel more whole than any loud night out ever had. I didn't know what we were building yet. I didn't know if it would last or if it even had a name. But I knew this something about her made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in years. And that, all on its own, was enough to make me come back. I returned 3 days later, and this time I didn't bring groceries. I didn't bring tea, muffins, or any excuse to justify my presence. I simply showed up because I wanted to. That was the first time I truly acknowledged it, not just to myself, but to her too. I pulled into her driveway with my heart beating faster than usual, not from nerves, but from something quieter, deeper. Anticipation? Maybe. Or maybe the comfort of knowing I was about to step into a space where I could just be. Her porch had become familiar to me, a kind of threshold between the noise of the outside world and the warmth she offered without even realizing it. When she opened the door, she looked surprised for a second, then something else softened in her features' relief. Maybe, or hope. She asked what I was doing there, and I told her simply, I missed you. She didn't say anything. She just stepped back and let me in, her eyes glinting with something that didn't need words. We spent the afternoon in the backyard again. The sun was out, filtered gently through thinning clouds, and the air held that early spring crispness that made you breathe a little deeper. She wore a wide-brimmed hat and those old gardening gloves that had more holes than fabric. I had brought a few bags of soil and some wooden stakes, still holding on to the idea of helping her rebuild the garden beds. She protested at first, saying it was too much work for a little patch of earth that might not grow anything. But I told her it didn't matter if it bloomed or not. Sometimes the act of planting something was enough. She gave me a look like she wasn't sure whether to roll her eyes or let herself believe it. She let herself believe it. As we worked, she talked about her first house with Marcus, a little bungalow with a tin roof that rattled in the rain. She said they used to sit on the porch with cheap wine and mismatched blankets, pretending the world beyond their street didn't exist. She said back then love felt like something loud and certain. Now, she said, it felt more like a whisper, something easy to miss if you weren't paying attention. I didn't ask what made her say that. I already knew. When the sun dipped behind the trees, we stepped back to look at what we'd done. It wasn't much, just a single rebuilt garden bed, the soil smoothed over, and a few labeled seed packets resting nearby. But it looked like a beginning. She turned to me and said she hadn't seen that part of the yard look that alive in years. Then, without warning, she reached out and touched my hand just briefly, just her fingertips grazing mine. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't planned. It was real. I looked down at our hands and then back at her, and for a moment neither of us moved. Then she pulled back and said she needed to put on the kettle, and the moment passed like a breath in cold air, felt deeply, seen clearly, and then gone. Inside, the house felt warmer, but I couldn't tell if it was the heater or the lingering closeness between us. She moved around the kitchen with a kind of practiced rhythm, setting mugs on the counter. Her hands steady, even though the space between us now felt slightly charged. I sat at the small breakfast table and watched her, trying not to read too much into the way she glanced at me when she thought I wasn't looking. We talked about small things, again, the weather, her neighbor's loud dog, a funny dream she had the night before. But underneath it all, there was something new. A current. A question neither of us wanted to ask yet. After tea, she surprised me by asking if I wanted to stay for a movie. She said she didn't usually watch much TV anymore, but had an old DVD player still hooked up and a box of classic films gathering dust. I said yes, without hesitation. We sat on her couch with a blanket stretched between us, not quite touching, but closer than before. The movie was some black and white drama about mistaken identity and lost love. And halfway through, she fell asleep, with her head resting against the edge of my shoulder. I didn't move. Not because I was afraid to wake her, but because I didn't want to. Her breathing was steady, soft, and I sat there watching the flicker of the screen dance across her face, wondering how I had ended up here sitting in a stranger's living room, who didn't feel like a stranger anymore. When the credits rolled, I gently shifted to let her rest more comfortably. And she stirred, blinking herself awake. For a moment, she looked confused, like she wasn't sure where she was. Then she smiled, slow, sleepy, and entirely unguarded. She apologized for dozing off, but I told her it was okay, more than okay. She sat up, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek, and looked at me for a long time without saying anything. I asked if she was all right, and she nodded, then said something that caught me completely off guard. "You feel safe," she whispered, like a pause in the noise. I didn't know what to say. No one had ever said something like that to me before. I wasn't sure I'd ever been anyone's pause. Something about her saying it made me feel like I could be. We sat there in the quiet for a while, neither of us needing to fill it. Eventually, I stood to leave, and she followed me to the door. This time, when I stepped outside, she reached out and touched my arm, not holding me, just anchoring me for a moment. Then, her voice barely above the wind, she said the words I hadn't realized I'd been waiting for. "Don't leave. I'm not joking." I stood there, frozen for a heartbeat, my mind suddenly blank and full all at once. She wasn't being playful. There was no smile, no laugh tucked behind her eyes. She meant it, really meant it. I looked at her, and in that split second, I saw everything she was carrying: years of loss, solitude, longing, strength. And yet she was still willing to open that door and let someone in, step back toward her, closing the distance. I told her I wouldn't. Not tonight. Inside the house welcomed us again. I followed her into the living room, unsure of what the evening would become, but knowing it would matter. Made us another cup of tea, and we sat side by side as the night settled around us, not with fireworks or declarations, but with something far more real presence. We didn't kiss. We didn't even hold hands. We just sat there, two people no longer trying to outrun the silence, but finally choosing to sit inside it together. The hours that followed were quiet, almost reverent, like the house itself understood. Something had changed. The kind of quiet that isn't empty, but full of things unsaid, of questions hanging in the air like soft lanterns, casting light but never fully illuminating the space. Madeline didn't rush to explain why she asked me to stay, and I didn't press her for more. We returned to the couch, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, two people sliding into a rhythm that neither of us planned, but both somehow recognized. She brought out a second blanket, the heavy knit one folded at the foot of the guest bed upstairs, and offered it to me with a soft glance. I thanked her, draping it over my lap as we both sank back into the cushions. The television was off now. The only sound was the distant hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the old wood floor settling beneath us. It was strange, how peaceful it felt, how unburdened. As though all the expectations that usually follow a night like this had evaporated before they even formed. She wasn't asking me to be anything more than present. And I wasn't expecting her to fill any role she hadn't offered at one point. She looked over at me, her eyes catching the lamplight, and said she hadn't shared a space like this with someone since before Marcus passed. She admitted carefully that it scared her, not me being there, but what it meant. what it stirred up. That she hadn't even realized how deeply she'd barricaded herself behind routines and rehearsed lines until someone arrived who didn't follow the script. I listened, the way she always listened to me, not trying to fix anything, just trying to understand. She spoke about the weight of memory, how it clung to the corners of her home like old dust, how even something as simple as the way sunlight fell through the blinds at 4 p.m. could remind her of conversations she'd never get to have again. I told her I understood, that grief was funny that way always waiting for quiet moments too. Show its face. She smiled, not because it was funny, but because it felt good to be understood without needing to explain every word. Time passed slowly in that room, stretching out like warm taffy, sweet and strange. At one point, she got up and lit a candle on the bookshelf. Not for scent or light, but just because she said the flicker felt alive. I watched the flame dance and realized she was right. There was something alive in that room, something waking, up between us. Not romance, not yet, not tension either, just an awareness. A recognition that we were both standing on the same side of a wall we'd each built for years. Only now, maybe beginning to take it down brick by brick. I don't remember falling asleep. One minute I was listening to her tell me about the time she got caught in a thunderstorm in Paris, how she laughed like a madwoman running through puddles because she didn't care if people stared on the next. I woke up with a crick in my neck and a blanket tucked up to my chin. The room was dim, the candle burned out, and she was gone from the couch. My watch read to 14 a.m. I stood slowly, stretching my arms, and noticed the door to the hallway slightly ajar, a soft light glowing from under it. I followed the light quietly, unsure if I should say anything, unsure if it was better to leave a note and go, or wait until morning. But when I stepped into the hallway, I saw her sitting at the kitchen table. Still in her cardigan, a mug cupped in her hands. She looked up as I entered, not startled, just tired, in a thoughtful kind of way. She said she couldn't sleep. Her body was used to the silence and didn't quite know what to do with comfort anymore. I nodded. I knew the feeling. I poured myself a glass of water and sat across from her. For a long moment, we didn't speak. Then she whispered something that stopped the air between us. I forgot what it was like to not want the night to end. She didn't look at me when she said it, just stared down into her mug like it held more than tea. I wanted to respond. I wanted to reach across the table and take her hand. But I didn't, not because I was afraid, but because I knew the moment wasn't asking for anything other than acknowledgement. So I said the only thing that felt right. Me too. We sat there until the candlelight in the kitchen burned out too, till the darkness stretched long and quiet, wrapping around us like something sacred. So eventually she stood and walked me to the front door. This time she didn't say, "Don't leave," but the look in her eyes asked me not to disappear. I promised I wouldn't. The drive home was silent again, but different from before. Not the silence of solitude, but the kind that follows something meaningful. My chest felt full, not heavy, and I caught myself replaying her laugh in my head, over and over. I wasn't sure what we were building, but I knew it wasn't temporary. I knew it wasn't casual. Something about this was starting to anchor me. And just before I pulled into my driveway, I received a text from her, short and simple thank you for showing up. The next morning came with gray skies and the kind of steady drizzle that made the world outside feel quieter than usual. I sat in my kitchen nursing a cup of coffee, staring out the window as raindrops traced slow, wandering lines down the glass. I had her message still open on my phone, "Thank you for showing up." And though it was only 5 words, they lingered like a weight pressed gently against my chest. I didn't reply right away, not because I didn't want to, but because I didn't quite know how. There was something sacred about the way the night ended. I wasn't sure if words on a screen could hold that same feeling, so I let the silence stretch between us, trusting it would hold. But by midday, I found myself back in my truck. Coffee refilled and windshield wipers slicing across the rhythm of the storm. I didn't have a delivery in her neighborhood. I didn't have any errands, excuses, or tasks lined up. I just had the pull. The sense that showing up again mattered more than anything else I could be doing. I didn't text ahead or knock when I got there. I waited in the driveway for a moment, watching the lights inside. When I finally stepped out and approached the porch, the door opened before I reached it. She stood there in a navy blue sweater and jeans, her hair loosely pulled back, and a look in her eyes that said she'd been hoping I would come. She stepped aside to let me in, and I shook off the rain from my jacket as I crossed the threshold. The house smelled like cinnamon and something faintly floral, lavender maybe, or whatever laundry scent clung to her. She told me she was about to make soup and asked if I'd like to stay for lunch. I said yes, not just because I was hungry, but because the idea of sharing something so simple, so domestic, felt like a privilege. We moved through the kitchen like we'd done it 100 times before, chopping vegetables, stirring broth, and trading soft laughter over a pot that steamed. Up the windows, at one point she reached across the counter to hand me a towel, and our fingers brushed for just a second. Neither of us commented, but the warmth of that touch lingered longer than the heat from the stove we ate in the nook near the back window, the storm tapping a steady rhythm on the glass behind us. She told me about her sister, who lived in New Mexico and was always trying to convince her to move closer. She said the idea of starting over in a new place sounded exhausting. Besides, the memories here, both good and bad, kept her grounded. I told her I understood, that there's something powerful about staying rooted in a place long enough to let it teach you things. Places hold ghosts, but they also hold growth. She smiled at that, like it made sense to her in a way she hadn't put into words before. After lunch, we cleared the dishes and returned to the living room. The rain hadn't let up, and neither of us seemed in a hurry to fill the day with anything more than being in the same space. She picked up a book from the shelf, the same one she'd read poetry from before, and handed it to me. She said she wanted to hear my voice read something for a change. I hesitated, caught off guard by the intimacy of the request. But I opened the book and began to read, my voice low and careful, unsure at first but steadier with each line. She closed her eyes as she listened, her hands folded in her lap, and for those few minutes, the room felt suspended outside of time. When I finished, she opened her eyes and whispered that Marcus used to read to her too, but that it felt different now. Not better or worse, just different. I nodded. I didn't want to take his place, and I knew she wasn't asking me to. What we were building was new, untitled, still unfolding. But there was comfort in the recognition. In the way we allowed each other to carry the past without letting it drown the present. That afternoon passed slowly, like the world outside had agreed to hold its breath for just a little while longer. When I finally stood to leave, she walked me to the door again, the same way she always did, but this time she paused just before opening it. She looked up at me and asked if I was free the following Sunday. I told her I was. She said she wanted to show me something, a trail she used to walk with Marcus that she hadn't visited in years. She said it was beautiful in the spring and she thought it might be time to go back. I said I'd be honored as I drove away that day. The rain beginning to lighten and the sky softening to a washed-out blue, I realized how gently the lines had shifted between us. We were no longer just a delivery guy and a lonely woman at the end of a driveway. We had become something else. Something fragile, still nameless, but real. And for the first time in a long time, I felt the stirrings of something I hadn't allowed myself to hope for: belonging. Later that night, just as I was about to turn off the bedside lamp, my phone buzzed. A message from her. Today felt like spring, even with the rain. I stared at it for a moment, then typed back, "That's because you let the light in." I didn't wait for a reply. I just turned off the light and let the quiet wrap around me like a promise. Sunday came, dressed in sunlight. The kind that filtered through the trees like a soft blessing. Warm but not overbearing. The kind of day you want to stretch your hours across like clean linen on a line. I arrived at her place early, just after 9. I'd debated what to wear, what to bring, even whether to shave. It felt ridiculous how much thought I'd put into it. But I knew this wasn't just a walk. Not really. She was inviting me into a memory. Into a place that held echoes of someone she once loved. And she was trusting me not to disrupt the quiet those echoes lived in. When she opened the door, she was already lacing up her boots. She wore a faded olive jacket, the same kind of sturdy and reliable garment that never tried to be fashionable. Her hair was pulled into a loose braid, a few strands curling along her cheeks. She smiled when she saw me. "Ann, easy, familiar thing, Nan," said she hoped I didn't mind a bit of mud. I said I didn't, and meant it. The idea of walking beside her anywhere, through anything, felt right. The trailhead wasn't far, just a 15-minute drive north, past old barns and quiet neighborhoods that seemed forgotten by time. The parking lot was empty when we arrived, the gravel crunching under the tires as I pulled in. She stepped out and took a long, quiet breath, her eyes scanning the tree line like she was greeting an old friend. I didn't speak. I just followed her lead. The trail was narrow, worn, but still firm beneath our feet. Wildflowers flanked either side, purples, yellows, and those little white ones that always looked like stars scattered across the grass. The air was rich with the scent of pine and damp earth, and somewhere in the distance a bird called out, its song trailing through the stillness like ribbon. We walked side by side, not speaking for a while, and it wasn't awkward. It was the kind of silence that comes only when both people know they don't need to fill it. She glanced at me now and then, as if checking to make sure I was still with her, and each time I met her eyes and nodded. I was dot after about 20 minutes. We came to a bend in the trail where a clearing opened up to a small overlook. There was a bench there, weathered and half covered in moss. She slowed her steps, and I could feel the shift in her, like she was bracing herself. She gestured toward the bench and said softly, "This is it." I followed her gaze to the trees beyond. They opened just enough to reveal a gentle valley, the stream glinting in the light below, and birds circling lazily above the treetops. It was breathtaking in its simplicity. She sat first, her hands resting in her lap, her shoulders slightly tense. I took a seat beside her, giving her space. She said she and Marcus used to come here in the early mornings, especially in spring, when the trees would burst with green and the world felt new again. She said he'd bring a thermos of coffee and 2 muffins wrapped in a napkin. And they'd sit here for an hour, sometimes without speaking, just watching the world turn slowly. She said this bench had held some of their best conversations and their hardest ones. Then she told me something that surprised me. She said the last time she'd been here was the day she told Marcus she was afraid he wouldn't be around much longer. He had laughed it off then, told her she was being dramatic. But she'd known. In her bones, she said, she could feel something shifting in him. That was 2 months before the diagnosis. 4 months before the end. She looked out over the valley as she said this, her voice calm, but her fingers trembling, ever so slightly. In her lap, I didn't know what to say, so I didn't say anything. I just reached over, slowly, and placed my hand over hers. She didn't pull away. In fact, she turned her hand under mine so our palms touched, warm and firm. We stayed like that for a while, watching the world move around us. The breeze picked up slightly, rustling the leaves, and I could smell the beginnings of honeysuckle in the air. Eventually she spoke again this time, her voice steadier. She said it felt different coming back here, like something had closed and opened again. At once, she said she thought coming here would make her feel the ache stronger, but instead, she felt something gentler. Not release, not forgiveness, just breath. Like she could finally exhale after holding everything in for so long. She looked at me then, and her eyes didn't hold pain anymore. They held presence. We stood after a while and continued walking, the trail looping back toward where we'd started. This time, we talked. She told me about how she met Marcus in a bookstore, how they reached for the same novel at the same time. I told her about my dad, who used to take me hiking in the summer when the air was thick and our feet ached from the miles. We traded stories like hands brushing against each other and passing, never grabbing, just touching, letting memory be a bridge instead of a barrier. Back at the car, she hesitated before getting in. She turned to me and said, "Thank you for coming here with me. I didn't know I needed it." I told her it was my privilege, and that I meant that. She smiled again, and this time it reached all the way up to her eyes. It wasn't a smile of relief or politeness. It was real. It was full. Something honest shining through. On the drive back, we didn't talk much, but her hand brushed against mine. On the console once, and instead of pulling away, she left it there, not quite holding, just resting. And I understood then that this wasn't a story about rescuing someone from grief. It was about showing up beside them long enough for them to choose their own way out, quietly, fully, at their own pace. And something told me. So had I. The days that followed settled into something unspoken but steady, like a low tide that never fully recedes. There was no dramatic change, no sudden declaration or grand gesture, but the air between us had thickened with a kind of knowing. We didn't speak daily, and when we did, it was rarely about what was happening between us. There was a rhythm forming, small and unmistakable. I would drop by with groceries, even when she hadn't placed an order. She would send me photos of the trail in different light, or of the muffins she baked with too much nutmeg and not enough sugar. And each of these exchanges, as simple as they were, felt like stitching thread pulling gently through fabric, mending something invisible and long ignored. One Wednesday, I arrived with a paper bag full of fresh produce and a note I had scribbled at the bottom of the receipt. Next walk, my turn to bring the muffins. She laughed when she read it, her hand grazing mine as she reached for the apples. There was something almost domestic about the way we moved through her kitchen that morning. It's not like guests or new acquaintances, but like people who had long ago learned to make space for each other. I chopped carrots while she rinsed lettuce, the radio humming low in the background, playing old jazz that neither of us really listened to, but neither turned off either. There was something beautiful in the mundanity of it all. Later that afternoon, I found myself parked outside the community center just 2 blocks away from her house, where I'd promised my niece I'd drop off a donation box. It should have been quick, just to drop and go. But as I passed by the side window of the hall, I noticed a flyer posted on the bulletin board inside. Spring dance night open to all ages. Bring a friend. I stood there staring at it for a long moment, my hand still on the door frame. Dance night. It's the kind of thing I hadn't thought about in years. It's the kind of thing I knew Marcus probably would have laughed at and twirled her into without a second thought, and I suddenly found myself wondering if Madeline missed dancing, or if that too had been boxed up and buried with the rest of the life she'd once had. I didn't mention the flyer to her immediately. I sat with it for a while, unsure whether it would feel like a gift or a trespass. She'd never once brought up dancing, never hinted at wanting that kind of thing back. But the way she moved in the kitchen, swaying slightly when the radio played, a familiar rhythm had made me wonder if her body remembered even when her heart didn't want to. So 2 days later, I brought it up not in person, but in another note. This time folded between the bananas and the bag I delivered. They're playing Ella Fitzgerald next Friday at the community center. I'll be there. No pressure. But if you happen to like old jazz and low lights, maybe I'll see you. She didn't respond that day. Or the next. I didn't bring it up either. I told myself I wouldn't be disappointed if she didn't come, that this wasn't about pushing her forward before she was ready. But by the time Friday arrived, I found myself shaving again, buttoning a shirt I hadn't worn in over a year, and practicing small smiles in the mirror that didn't look too eager. I told myself I was going for the music, for the chance to feel something outside of routine. No, but my hands were clumsy with expectation. The community center was dimly lit, strung with paper lanterns and warm bulbs that cast gentle golden halos across the hardwood floors. Couples swayed in slow rhythm, the music soft and tender, the kind that didn't demand talent, just willingness. I stood off to the side, nursing a cup of punch that tasted vaguely of ginger and something else I couldn't place. I waited, pretending I wasn't watching the door, pretending I wasn't listening for the sound of her steps. 15 minutes passed, then 20, and 45. And just as I was about to give up and leave, the door creaked open behind me. I didn't have to turn around to know it was her. The room changed when she walked in. Not loudly, not obviously, but in the way everything's subtle shifts toward warmth. She wore a dark green dress that matched the softness of her eyes, and a scarf knotted around her neck like a quiet statement. Her expression was cautious, almost questioning. But when she saw me, her lips lifted into the kind of smile that only forms when someone's heart has just agreed to something their mind was unsure of. She walked over slowly, her steps confident, but careful. I didn't ask why she changed her mind, didn't ask why she waited so long to decide. Just extended my hand and asked, "May I have this dance?" And she said, "Only if you promise to keep your feet off mine." We danced. Clumsily at first, like two people learning a language they'd once spoken but forgotten over time. But with each step, each turn, something softened. We weren't good, not by any technical standard. But we were real, present, and somewhere. Between Ella's verses and the distant clatter of cups at the back table, I realized I hadn't felt this kind of ease in years. Not the easy comfort of being alone, the ease of being seen. Truly seen. When the song ended, I didn't let go immediately. She didn't step back. We stood there for a beat longer than necessary, our hands still joined. The air between us charged not with romance, but with relief. Like two people discovering they could still open, still stretch toward joy without breaking, as we walked out together into the cool night air. I asked if she wanted me to walk her home. She didn't answer at first, just looked up at the stars. Then she said softly, "Only if you don't leave this time." She wasn't joking. The walk back to her house was quiet. But not in the way silence sometimes stretches awkwardly between two people unsure of what to say. This quiet had weight, intention, like a blanket pulled gently around both of us. The stars above were faint, tucked behind a veil of clouds, and the street lamps cast elongated shadows that swayed as we moved. Our hands brushed occasionally, and once, without looking, she slipped her fingers into mine. I didn't tighten my grip. I didn't pull away. I just let it happen. Let it be what it was. Something simple, something real. Each step felt like an unspoken promise, a shared understanding that whatever we were building didn't need rushing or labels. It just needed room. When we reached her front porch, she hesitated at the steps. She looked over her shoulder at me, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then she said she had chamomile tea and a slice of lemon cake that probably needed finishing. I nodded, understanding the invitation for what it was, not a romantic overture, but a continuation of the space we'd been carving out together, one small gesture at a time. Inside, the house smelled of something sweet and warm, and a faint breeze carried the scent of her shampoo as she moved. Ahead of me into the kitchen, she lit a candle on the table and filled the kettle, her motions unhurried, deliberate. I sat across from her, watching the way the soft glow flickered in her eyes. When the tea was ready and the cake plated between us, she finally spoke. She said the last time she danced was at her niece's wedding 3 years ago, and even then, it had been brief, reluctant. She admitted something she hadn't shared before that after Marcus passed. Part of her felt guilty anytime she smiled too much, laughed too freely, or felt anything close to joy. That it was easier to stay in the predictable rhythm of loneliness than risk the unknown shape of happiness again. I listened without interrupting, the words falling between us like delicate rain, each one washing something old away. She said that dancing with me didn't feel like betraying him, didn't feel like replacing him, felt like remembering who she was before everything became heavy. She paused then, her eyes on the steam curling up from her mug. Then she looked at me and whispered, "Thank you for not treating me like I'm broken." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just reached for her hand again, and this time she held on tightly. We sat there for a long while, sipping tea and sharing cake, not saying much, but speaking volumes in the small ways we looked at each other. At one point, she stood to get a blanket from the couch and draped it around both of our shoulders as she sat beside me. Her head eventually rested on my shoulder, and I could feel the slow, steady rise and fall of her breath. It was the kind of closeness that didn't demand anything, simply offered presence. Outside, the wind picked up slightly, rustling the leaves and making the porch creak in that familiar, comforting way old houses often do. She told me that sometimes she missed things she never thought she'd miss: arguments about what to cook for dinner, the way Marcus left his socks on the floor, the noise of a television left on too loud. She laughed softly, almost embarrassed, but I told her I understood. Love leaves echoes, and even the annoyances become something you reach for. When everything else grows too quiet, that night, I didn't leave right away. We stayed up until the candle burned down to a stub and the tea turned cold. We talked about everything and nothing, our favorite childhood snacks. The first time we each got in trouble at school, the places we still wanted to visit. It felt like time had softened around us, wrapping the moment in something sacred. When I finally stood to go, she walked me to the door and stood close, so close I could feel the warmth of her breath. She didn't ask me to stay again. She didn't need to. Her eyes said enough. Before I left, I turned back one more time on the porch and said I'd see her tomorrow. She smiled, tired but content, and simply said, "I'd like that." I walked back to my truck slowly, the night air crisp and clear now. There was no ache in my chest, no confusion about what this was becoming. I didn't know what the next step was. I just knew I'd take it with her. That night, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling for a long time. Her voice echoed in my head. Not the words exactly, but the tone, the softness, the steadiness, the fragile hope that had started to take root again. I thought about how unexpected this all was. I never planned for any of it. I was just a guy delivering groceries. But sometimes, the smallest doors lead to the rooms you never knew you needed to enter. And with her, I wasn't just walking through those doors. I was learning how to leave them open. The next morning, she texted me before I could text her, a photo of the trail we'd walked, bathed in sunlight. Underneath it, just one sentence: "Today feels lighter." And for the first time in a long time, so did I. The day after her text, I decided not to wait until the next grocery order. I called and asked if she wanted company on her errands. There was a pause on the line, brief, maybe uncertain. But then she said yes, and I could hear the soft smile in her voice. We agreed to meet at her place around noon. It felt strangely significant, like we were making a plan not just to pass time, but to inhabit it together. I showed up 10 minutes early, as usual, and when she opened the door, she had that look again, not surprised exactly, but still somehow caught off guard by my consistency. As if it wasn't something she was used to, but was slowly learning. To trust, she wore simple jeans and a navy sweater, her hair pulled back in a loose ponytail that framed her face just enough to show how little she was trying. I liked that about her, how effortless she was. There was no performance in the way she presented herself. She moved through the world as someone who had nothing to prove and nothing left to chase, only things she wanted to tend to. Got in my truck and headed to the post office first. She had a few packages to return, things she said she ordered late at night. When the house felt too quiet and she needed something to do with her hands, I didn't laugh, understood. Sometimes you reach for whatever fills the silence, even if it's a pair of shoes you'll never wear. The post office line was long. The fluorescent lighting gave everything a kind of sterile glow. We stood shoulder to shoulder, and she glanced at the posters on the wall, missing mail warnings, passport renewal deadlines, the usual bureaucratic clutter. She leaned in slightly and whispered that she once had a pen pal in Italy when she was 10, and how she still remembered the smell of the envelopes. How they carried with them something magical, like air from another world. I told her I used to tape baseball cards to my letters to my cousin just so they'd feel heavier in his hands. We laughed about that quietly, but I noticed the way her hand brushed mine again, casual but deliberate, like she was growing more comfortable with closeness. After the post office, we stopped at a little hardware store off Maple Avenue. She needed new batteries for the smoke detectors and mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that the faucet in her laundry room was leaking again. I offered to take a look, and she didn't resist. That mattered. Not because I wanted to be useful, but because letting someone into the more broken corners of your home isn't always about needing help. Sometimes it's just about not wanting to feel alone while you figure things out. At the register, she insisted on paying. I tried to argue, but she held up one hand, firm and amused, and said, "I let you bring me groceries and cake. Let me buy the batteries." I surrendered, smiling as the cashier rang us up. We got lunch from a little corner diner I'd passed 100 times, but never stopped at. She said the grilled cheese was surprisingly good, and I trusted her judgment. We sat in a booth by the window, watching cars pass and people cross the street like they were moving through a world just slightly adjacent to ours. The food came fast, warm, and simple, and we ate in a rhythm that felt easy, as if this had been our routine for years. At one point, she looked up and said, "I haven't done this with anyone in a long time." She didn't explain what this meant, but she didn't have to. I nodded because I hadn't either. When we returned to her house, she handed me a flashlight and led me to the laundry room. The leak wasn't bad, just a slow, tired drip from a connection that needed tightening. While I worked, she sat nearby on a stool, sipping tea and telling me about the time. She tried to repaint the laundry room walls herself and ended up with more paint in her hair than on the wall. She said Marcus had laughed so hard he nearly dropped his coffee and how she hadn't been mad, just relieved to see him laugh like that. I told her I liked that story, and she said she did too, though she didn't tell it often. After the faucet was fixed and I packed away the tools, we ended up back in the kitchen. She offered me more tea and I didn't say no. The late afternoon light poured through the windows, golden and thick, casting soft shadows across the table.
We didn't talk much then.
Just sat. And it struck me how rare that was. How rare. It was to sit in silence with someone and feel completely unhurried. She closed her eyes for a moment, just resting her head back against the chair, and I watched her. Not with desire, not even with hope, but with appreciation. Like standing before a painting you didn't expect to like, but suddenly can't look away from. She opened her eyes and caught me watching. Instead of looking away, she smiled softly, curiously. Then she said something that stayed with me long after I left. "It's strange," she said, "how something can feel both new and familiar at the same time." I asked her if she meant me, and she didn't answer. But the way she reached for my hand told me everything I needed to know. That evening, I didn't stay for dinner. I told her I'd come by tomorrow, see if the faucet held. She nodded and said she'd make soup. As I left, I paused at the door and looked back. She was already in the hallway, turning off the light. But she turned too, just briefly, and we held each other's gaze from across the quiet space of her home. And then, that silence. Something settled between us. Not a promise. Just a quiet agreement that neither of us was alone anymore. Not really. The next day came with gray skies and the kind of stillness that made everything feel suspended. Like the world had paused mid-breath. I arrived at her place mid-morning. With my toolbox in the back seat, though I knew the faucet wasn't leaking anymore, I didn't come for repairs. I came because it was starting to feel like part of my day belonged there. Inside that old white house with the ivy curling around, the porch rails, and the gentle scent of citrus candles that always lingered near the door. She opened it before I knocked, as if she'd been waiting just out of sight, already expecting me. No surprise in her eyes this time, just calm recognition. She stepped aside without a word, and I followed her in. She was wearing an apron, and there was a pot on the stove already simmering. The air was thick with the scent of something earth, onions, carrots, maybe rosemary. I told her it smelled like someone who knew what they were doing, and she just gave me that half smile again, the one that had become more frequent in the past few days. She said soup was the only thing she didn't overthink. She'd been cooking it since she was 12, standing beside her grandmother, stirring pots without measurements and learning to trust her own instincts. I told her that sounded like the best kind of education. She handed me a wooden spoon and said, "Then it's your turn." I stirred as she cleaned up the cutting board, both of us moving in that quiet tandem again, a soft domestic dance that neither of us acknowledged but both understood. The soup bubbled, and we took turns tasting and seasoning until it tasted like something shared. We ate by the window, watching the rain start to patter gently against the glass. She told me about a summer she spent in Oregon once, how the rain there never felt cold. I told her about the first time I saw snow and how I thought it would be quieter, softer, like in the movies, but it had been wet and loud and so bright it made my eyes ache. She laughed, not because the story was funny, but because it gave her a glimpse of something real, something lived. After lunch, she asked if I wanted to stay a while. I nodded. She brought out a puzzle, one of those massive 1,000-piece ones, with a vintage bookstore scene full of tiny details. I hadn't done a puzzle in years, but she said it calmed her, gave her hands something to do while her mind drifted. We sat on the floor with mugs of lukewarm tea nearby and scattered pieces between us like a map we were trying to make sense of. I watched the way she turned the pieces over, studying the edges before placing each one down with quiet satisfaction. She didn't rush. She didn't fidget. There was a patience in her I admired, one I didn't always find in myself. A few hours passed like that, slow and steady, the puzzle growing quietly between us. There were long stretches where we didn't speak, but nothing about the silence felt empty. It was peaceful, like being in the eye of a storm that neither of us had to, whether alone anymore. Eventually, she leaned back against the couch, stretching her legs and resting her head on the cushions. She looked over at me and said softly, "Do you ever feel like you're waiting for your life to start, even when it already has?" Answer right away. I knew that feeling too well. That sense of standing still while time moved around you. I told her sometimes I wondered if I was living or just filling time. That maybe I'd confused routine with purpose. She looked at me for a long moment, not with pity, but with that quiet empathy she carried so naturally. Then she said, "I think we all do that in different ways. We hold our breath, waiting for something to happen, when really, it already is." And just like that, I realized how much had shifted without either of us noticing. What started as something practical, a grocery delivery, a neighborly errand, had become something else entirely. Something that wrapped itself around our mornings, and our afternoons, our silences, and our glances. When it started to get late, I moved to stand, but she reached out and gently took my wrist. She didn't say anything, but I sat back down beside her, and for a moment, we just looked at the puzzle together. She picked up one last piece and fitted it into a corner. Then she rested her hand on mine and said, "I'm not used to having someone hear this much." I asked if she wanted that to change. She looked at me, not answering immediately, and then said, "No. I'm just trying to remember how to share space again. It's strange how much you forget when you've been alone for a while." I told her we didn't have to figure it out all at once, that we could take it a piece at a time, like the puzzle. She smiled and said, "That's probably the only way it works anyway." We stayed like that until the rain stopped, the clouds thinning just enough to let in a pale orange light from the setting sun. I helped her clean up the pieces, put the box away, and she walked me to the door again. This time there was no hesitation. She stepped closer, leaned in, and rested her forehead lightly against my shoulder. Not a hug, not a kiss. Just closeness, pressed quietly against the space where her grief used to sit alone. I didn't ask what it meant. I didn't need to. Some things are too fragile to define too soon. I just stood there with her, holding that quiet moment as carefully as I could, knowing full well that whatever we were building wasn't finished yet. But it had begun. The following morning began like most of the others in recent days, slow, quiet, and oddly comforting. I didn't hear from her early, but I didn't think much of it. We'd started settling into a rhythm that didn't require constant contact. It was a kind of mutual understanding, a balance between togetherness and breathing room. Around mid-morning, I sent a short message anyway. "How's the soup holding up?" I didn't get a reply right away, which wasn't unusual. She wasn't glued to her phone the way most people were. In fact, that was part of her charm, how present she was when she was with you, by early afternoon. Though curiosity pulled me back to her front steps. I had an excuse in hand, a set of extra filters she mentioned needing for her HVAC system. When she opened the door, I noticed immediately that her posture was different. Not closed off exactly, but more reserved. She offered a small smile and stepped aside to let me in, but something in her energy had shifted. There was a tightness in the way she held her shoulders, a slowness in her voice that hadn't been there the day before. I asked if everything was okay. She paused for a beat, then said her sister had called. They didn't talk often, but when they did, it was usually intense, filled with reminders of what had been left behind or not dealt with properly. Her sister lived 2 states away, and I had a habit of dropping opinions into conversations like stones into water, leaving ripples that reached much further than she probably realized. This time, it had been about me. Apparently, the sister had seen us together on a neighbor's social media post, just a photo of the two of us at the farmer's market. Blurry but unmistakable. I could tell by the way she looked at me that this wasn't a conversation she wanted to have, but one she felt she had to. Her sister had asked questions, pointed ones. Was she dating again? Wasn't it too soon to be seen with someone else? Did she really think she was ready for that kind of connection after everything she'd been through? And the worst part, Dolores admitted quietly, was that she didn't have answers. Not the kind her sister wanted, and maybe not even the kind she herself fully understood. She said it all made her feel exposed, like our quiet little world had been cracked open and suddenly had to answer to a chorus of voices that didn't know what we were building. I told her she didn't owe anyone an explanation, that what we had, whatever it was, didn't need a label or a defense. But I also understood, family has a way of reaching inside you, grabbing hold of old guilt and stirring it around until you're not sure which parts are yours and which parts are theirs. I told her I'd give her space if that's what she needed. She shook her head almost too quickly and said no, that wasn't it. It wasn't about retreating. It was about learning to stand still while the wind blew around her. So we stayed. No puzzles this time, no errands. Just the two of us sitting on the couch, quietly watching the muted TV in the background. The show didn't matter. The sound was low enough to ignore. But the closeness remained, even in her silence. Every now and then she'd reach for my hand again, almost like checking to make sure I was still there, and I always was. The weight of her fingers in mine didn't feel like uncertainty. It felt like anchoring later that day. As the light dimmed and rain threatened again, she stood up and said she wanted to show me something. I followed her down the hall, past the laundry room and her bedroom, to a narrow door I hadn't noticed before. She opened it slowly and revealed a small storage space, barely lit, filled with boxes and old keepsakes. She pulled out one box and opened the lid to reveal dozens of letters, some tied with string, others loose and faded with age. These, she said softly, are everything Marcus and I ever wrote to each other. From when we were dating, during his deployments, even after we got married, I haven't read them in years. She ran her fingers along the edges of one envelope, but didn't pull it out. Instead, she sat on the floor, the box between her knees, and looked up at me. I used to think I'd have to stop loving him in order to move forward, she said. But maybe that's not true. Maybe there's room for both. I sat beside her and didn't say anything. I just let the words hang. They're fragile and precious. Because they were true, grief doesn't erase love. It folds it into something different. Softer, quieter, but no less real. And sometimes the people we meet later don't replace what came before. They simply light the path forward. She didn't. Read the letters. She just closed the box again and slid it back onto the shelf. When we got up, she looked at me with a kind of tired honesty that I hadn't seen before. Not exhaustion, but emotional clarity. The kind that comes after you finally say something you've been carrying too long. I told her I wasn't going anywhere unless she asked me to. And she nodded, her lips parting just slightly, as if to respond. But instead, she leaned in and rested her head against my chest. We stood there for a long time, in the dim hallway. The rain now gently tapping the windows above us. There was no resolution that day. No sudden shift into something defined or romantic. She laughed, not because the story was funny, but because it gave her a glimpse of something real, something lived. After lunch, she asked if I wanted to stay a while. I nodded. She brought out a puzzle, one of those massive 1,000-piece ones, with a vintage bookstore scene full of tiny details. I hadn't done a puzzle in years, but she said it calmed her, gave her hands something to do while her mind drifted. We sat on the floor with mugs of lukewarm tea nearby and scattered pieces. Between us, like a map we were trying to make sense of. I watched the way she turned the pieces over, studying the edges before placing each one down with quiet satisfaction. One morning I brought coffee with the bags and she met me on the porch in her robe, her hair still messy from sleep. She looked at me, smiled without saying anything, and took the cup like it had always been mine to bring her. We sat on the steps, sipping quietly, watching the fog lift off the street. She said her neighbor across the way had started asking questions, curious ones, not cruel. Dolores didn't mind. She said there was something nice about being noticed again, about being someone that people asked about. I asked her if she wanted them to know. She shrugged, then said, "Let them wonder." We started cooking together more often. Not just the soup or quick sandwiches, but slow meals, roasts, baked pasta, pancakes from scratch. She had a way of moving in the kitchen that made it feel like choreography. She never measured ingredients, just tossed things together by memory, intuition. I admired that. I was always more exacting, more structured, but with her, I started to loosen. She laughed once when I accidentally added cumin instead of cinnamon to the applesauce. She said it tasted like confusion, but still ate 2 bites just to prove a point. Some evenings I stayed long after the dishes were done. We didn't always talk. Sometimes we just sat near each other, reading or listening to music. She had a small record player and an old collection that smelled like dust and nostalgia. Nina Simone, Leonard Cohen, Ella Fitzgerald. She said she liked voices with weight, voices that carried stories in them. One night, as Ella's voice floated through the room, she stood and offered her hand. "I don't dance," I told her. She just smiled and said, "Neither do I." We swayed slowly in her living room, the lamp casting a soft halo on the wall behind us, her head resting gently against my shoulder. It wasn't a dance. Not really, it was something quieter. It's like a conversation without words. Her fingers found mine, and for the first time since I'd met her, she didn't pull away. It wasn't a kiss. Not yet. But it was the kind of closeness that held the promise of one. Later that week, I came by with a few things she'd asked for, a particular kind of tea. Some candles she liked, a small plant she said would look good by her window. When I arrived, she wasn't in the kitchen or on the porch. I found her in the spare room, sitting on the floor surrounded by photo albums. She didn't hear me at first, or maybe she did and just didn't say anything. When she looked up, her eyes weren't wet, but they were glossy, like memories had risen to the surface and stayed there. She gestured for me to sit, and I did wordlessly beside her. She opened one of the albums and pointed to a picture of herself from maybe 20 years ago, sitting in the same room, with Marcus behind her, arms draped loosely over her shoulders. They looked like people still figuring things out but doing it together. She said that room had always been meant for guests but was never really used. I think it stayed empty because part of me never believed anyone else would belong in this house, she said quietly. Until now, I didn't know what to say. Some moments are too delicate for reassurance. So I just placed my hand gently over hers. She closed the album, set it aside, and leaned against me like she had that day in the hallway. This time, though, I wrapped my arm around her without thinking. We stayed like that for a while, in the spare room full of echoes, the afternoon, light spilling across the floor in warm streaks. That night, as I stood to leave, she followed me to the door and paused. "Would you stay for dinner tomorrow?" she asked. "Something real? I'll set the table. Maybe even light those ridiculous candles." I told her I'd bring dessert. She smiled, nodded once, and before I could turn, she reached up, brushed something from my collar, and let her fingers linger just a little too long. It was the first time I felt something pass between us like a current knot, just comfort, but something quietly electric. I walked to my truck in the fading light, her silhouette still visible through the screen door. The sky above was streaked with pink and silver, the kind of sunset that made everything feel possible. I sat in the cab for a minute, not starting the engine, just breathing. I realized then how deeply I'd started to need her presence, not in some all-consuming way, but in a steady, grounding kind of way. Like the difference between being alone and being at peace, it wasn't love yet. Or maybe it was, and we were just too careful to call it that. But something was growing, steady and sure, between shared meals and soft silences. Something that didn't rush, didn't demand, didn't need to prove itself. And for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of what might come next. The following evening arrived like the gentle closing of a book chapter. It's not rushed, not loud, just quietly significant in a way I could feel in my chest. I spent more time than usual deciding what to wear. Not out of vanity, but because I didn't want to show up looking like I hadn't noticed the shift between us. I brought dessert, just like I promised, a small chocolate tart from a bakery I'd never gone into until today, with a little handwritten tag on the box that read for something sweet. I wasn't sure if it felt too deliberate, but it didn't matter. I just wanted the gesture to land where words hadn't yet. She opened the door before I could knock. Barefoot, with a pale blue dress that matched the stillness of the hour. Hair was pulled back loosely, a few strands falling across her face that she didn't bother to fix. The dining table was set properly, with cloth napkins, candles flickering at each end, and two plates with mismatched silverware that somehow looked right together. There was music playing softly, an old Billie Holiday record humming in the background, her voice like silk against the air. Dinner was roasted chicken with lemon and thyme, salad with figs and walnuts, and a bottle of wine already breathing. On the counter, felt like something from a different time, a kind of intimacy people wrote about more than lived. We ate slowly, between conversation and long pauses that didn't ask to be filled. She told me about a time she almost moved to Italy after college, how she spent a whole year saving up and then let the dream slip away because Marcus had proposed. She didn't say it with bitterness, just reflection, as if looking back at someone else's fork in the road and wondering quietly who that version of her might have become. I asked if she regretted it, and she shook her head. No, she said, I just think about her sometimes. The girl who almost did something bold. Told her I thought boldness looked different for everyone, and that staying, loving, during those things were brave in ways people rarely noticed. She looked at me then, not with surprise, but like I had said something she hadn't realized she needed to hear. We lingered after the plates were cleared, sipping the last of the wine, the candles burning low. She didn't move to blow them out, and neither did I. It was that moment in an evening where most people would gather their things and say goodnight. But she stayed seated, one knee pulled up beneath her, watching me like she was still deciding something. Eventually she spoke. Her voice was quieter than before. I think I've been waiting for someone to make me feel seen again, she said, not in the way people glance at you in public, but really seen, like who I am now, not who I was, or who they thought I might still be. She didn't look away when she said it. She met my gaze and held it steady and open. I didn't try to offer some poetic answer. I just told her I saw her, that I had from the first day when she'd stood on her porch clutching her grocery list and trying to mask the ache of solitude with organization. She stood up then and walked over to the record player. The song had ended, and she set the needle. Back to the beginning, without a word. Then she turned back to me and said, Would you stay a little longer? I nodded, my throat dry, and followed her to the living room. She curled up on the couch and patted the cushion beside her, and I sat down without hesitation. We didn't touch at first. We just sat, our arms barely grazing, the air between us humming with something quieter than tension and louder than peace. It was anticipation, maybe, or recognition, or something that didn't need a name. She shifted slightly, and her hand found mine, again familiar now, but never assumed. She turned her face toward me, her eyes searching. And then she said it, not in a whisper, not dramatically, but with the steadiness of someone who had thought the words through. I don't want to keep pretending this is just friendship. My chest tightened not with fear, but with the weight of everything those words carried. The risk, the history, the hope. I told her I didn't either, that every minute spent here felt more like home than any place I'd been in years. She looked down, her fingers tightening around mine just slightly, and then said, I'm scared. I don't know how to do this slowly. I don't know if I even should. I told her we could go at her pace, at our pace, that there was no clock ticking, no finish line we had to reach, that whatever we were building didn't have to look like anything she'd known before, that could be new and different. And ours. She leaned in slowly, so slowly it didn't even feel like movement until her forehead rested gently against mine. No kiss, just breath and warmth and closeness. She exhaled, and it felt like a piece of her was being released, not to let go of what she had loved before, but to make space for something new. When I finally left that night, the candles had burned nearly to the base, and the sky outside had shifted from dusk to deep blue. She stood at the door like always, but this time she didn't say goodbye. She just looked at me and said, Tomorrow? And I said, of course. The next morning felt different, and it wasn't just the sunlight spilling across my kitchen table or the warmth in the coffee I didn't drink right away. It was the feeling that something had shifted, not just between us, but inside me. ... Weight I hadn't realized I'd been carrying was suddenly lighter. I moved through my day with a quiet focus, aware of everything but rushing nothing. I packed her usual groceries, but I added a few extra things I knew she liked but wouldn't ask for. A small jar of fig jam, a carton of berries. A loaf of that soft, flour-dusted bread, she once said, reminded her of childhood summers in her grandmother's house. I knocked on her door just past noon. She answered almost instantly, as if she'd been waiting nearby. She was in jeans and a cotton shirt, her hair pulled into a low braid that swung softly as she opened the door. She stepped aside without saying anything, but the way she looked at me made words unnecessary. I walked in, set the bags on the counter, and turned just in time to see her watching me with something unreadable behind her eyes. It wasn't hesitation, it was more like reverence, or the careful study of someone you're still a little afraid to need. We didn't speak much at first. She unpacked the groceries, smiling faintly when she found the jam, then paused when she noticed the bread. She held it in both hands and glanced at me over her shoulder, something like nostalgia washing over her. "You remembered," she said. Softly, I just nodded, unsure what to say, and she placed it gently on the counter like it was something sacred. We ate lunch on the porch, the air warm but not stifling. The conversation moved in and out of serious things. She told me she used to paint, not houses or walls, but canvases, small, expressive pieces she rarely showed anyone. When I asked why she stopped, she said she never intended to. Life just got full, and then suddenly, it was too quiet to fill with art. I told her I'd love to see her paintings if she ever felt like sharing. She smiled, but didn't promise. Anything after lunch, we stayed outside, the silence stretching comfortably between us. She leaned against the railing, her fingers idly tracing the grain of the wood. I sat across from her, legs stretched out, watching how the wind played with the edges of her shirt. Eventually, she spoke, her voice barely louder than the breeze. "This thing between us," she began. "I don't want it to be a placeholder. I don't want it to be something I reach for just because I'm lonely." The words hung in the air, suspended and real. I told her I didn't want to be a placeholder either, that what I felt wasn't convenience, it was clarity. I had known loneliness too, the kind that followed you into crowded rooms and hummed in your chest, even when you were smiling. But this, what we had, it didn't feel like loneliness fading. It felt like something being found. She nodded slowly, her eyes drifting toward the yard as if the trees could offer some answer. "I've spent so long figuring out how to be okay alone," she said. "I didn't think I'd have to relearn how to let someone in." I told her that maybe it wasn't about relearning. Maybe it was about discovering what that looked like now, for who she had become, not who she used to be. Later in the afternoon, we walked through the neighborhood, something we hadn't done since that early trip to the market. This time there was no list, no agenda, just slow steps, her hand occasionally brushing mine. Both of us pretending not to notice the way our fingers kept finding each other. A few neighbors waved from porches. One older gentleman with a straw hat called out, "Nice day for a stroll with your fella," and Dolores laughed, a real laugh, full and open. She didn't correct him. When we returned, she asked if I wanted to stay a bit longer. I said yes, without hesitation. We sat on the couch, the late-day sun casting golden stripes across the rug. She tucked her feet beneath her and leaned into my side, her head resting against my shoulder. Her breath was steady, her body warm against mine. We didn't speak for a long time. We just existed in the quiet that only people who feel safe together can share. As the sky darkened, I finally turned to her and said, "You don't have to be sure right now, you just have to be honest." She looked up, her eyes soft but serious. "I am being honest," she whispered. "I'm scared, but I want to try." I kissed the top of her head, the gesture gentle, not rushed, not claiming, just affirming. We stayed like that until long after the first stars appeared, wrapped in silence and slow realization. And when I left that night, her hand lingered on mine at the door just a second longer than usual. I didn't need her to say it, and she didn't need me to ask. Whatever this was, it was real, it was careful, it was growing into something worth protecting. The next few days unfolded with an ease that almost felt surreal. It's like we had finally stepped into the rhythm that had always been waiting for us. I still brought groceries, still knocked on her door with my shoulder balanced against a paper bag and my breath a little more held than before. But now there was something different in the air between us. It wasn't anticipation anymore. It was presence. Calm, quiet assurance that whatever we were growing wasn't fleeting. Dolores greeted me each time with a smile that no longer needed words to explain itself, and I found that my own face softened the second I saw hers. One morning, as we unpacked the bags together, she reached for a jar on the top shelf and winced slightly. Without a word, I stepped behind her, one hand steadying the small of her back, while the other retrieved what she couldn't reach. She leaned into my hand for just a moment, enough for me to feel the weight of her trust. When she turned, our eyes met in the close space between the pantry door and the counter. We didn't move away right away. There was no need. That pause, brief as it was, carried more honesty than 100 conversations. Later that afternoon, she invited me to help her in the backyard. There was a corner near the fence where weeds had taken over, and she wanted to plant something new. She said it felt like the right time to start over. I knelt beside her in the soil, our hands brushing. As we dug side by side, she wore a wide-brimmed hat that shaded her eyes, but couldn't hide the way they sparkled when the sunlight broke through the leaves overhead. We didn't talk much, just worked, breathed, existed beside each other in the smell of dirt and the warmth of shared effort. At one point, she paused and said, "You know, this space has been empty for years. I always thought I'd wait until someone else came along before I fixed it up." I looked at her and said maybe it was waiting for the right reason. She didn't reply, but she reached for my hand, fingers muddy and trembling slightly. We sat back on our heels and looked at the patch of ground we'd cleared together. It wasn't much just earth and hope, but it felt sacred. As evening crept in, she invited me to stay for dinner again, but this time we didn't bother with formality. We made sandwiches and ate them on the living room floor, legs crossed, the overhead light dimmed low. She played an old playlist from her phone songs she said she used to listen to during long drives, songs that reminded her of who she'd been and who she'd wanted to become. When one familiar melody came on, she looked at me and said, "This was my favorite song when I was 23. I used to think I'd danced to it at my wedding." I asked her if she ever had. She shook her head and whispered no, but maybe I still can. And just like that, without thinking, I reached for her hand and stood. She hesitated only for a breath before joining me, and we danced slow, barely moving, more like swaying. In time was something that neither of us could name, but both of us felt deeply. Her head rested against my chest, and I could feel her heartbeat, soft but steady. I held her like she was something fragile and familiar all at once. After the song ended, she didn't pull away. She stayed there, held close, her breath warming, the space just below my collarbone. When she finally looked up, there was something in her eyes, something raw and quiet and open. And then finally it happened. Our lips met, not with urgency, but with a tenderness that made everything else fall away. It was a kiss born not of longing, but of arrival, recognition. We didn't speak for a long time after, just sat beside each other on the couch, our shoulders touching, her fingers woven through mine, like they belonged there. At some point, she laid her head in my lap, and I brushed a loose strand of hair from her cheek. Forgot what it felt like to be held like this. Not because someone wants something, but because they mean it. I told her I wasn't going anywhere. That I was here because I wanted to be, not because she needed me. She nodded, eyes still closed. I sat there with her as the house fell into a hush. It felt like something had finally settled between us, something deep, rooted, unshaken. The walls that had quietly guarded our hearts for so long had opened just enough to let light in, and it was enough. Not everything had been. Said not everything had been solved. But what mattered was now clear. We had found something neither of us expected, and both of us were choosing it. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the trees in her backyard. A storm was forecasted for the night, but inside, everything was still. Everything was safe. And when I finally rose to leave, she didn't walk me to the door. Instead, she stayed where she was and simply said, "Come back tomorrow." Didn't need to answer, just leaned down, kissed her forehead, and walked out into the evening with a heart that felt fuller than it had in years. The morning after our kiss, I woke up earlier than usual, though there was no alarm, no obligation calling me. The sky outside my window was a soft, sleepy gray, the kind that promised a quiet day and maybe a bit of rain. I sat up in bed for a moment and just breathed, letting the stillness settle in. My thoughts, though gentle, were crowded with the memory of Dolores, her head on my chest, the weight of her trust, the way she had whispered not with desperation but with hope. Everything between us now carried a different weight, and I wasn't scared of it, but I was cautious with it, the way you might carry something you don't want to drop, even by accident. I debated texting her, but decided against it. Something about the space between us needed to breathe, not in avoidance, but in respect. I figured I'd show up with her groceries as usual, let the rhythm continue. Not as if nothing happened, but as if something had begun. And so, I filled the paper bag slowly, making sure to include her usual favorites. Plus, a small bouquet of white peonies I picked up from a stand on the corner. I wasn't sure why I bought them, maybe just to mark this day as different. When I arrived at her door, it took her a little longer than usual to answer. For a fleeting moment, I wondered if something had changed overnight, if the silence that followed a beautiful moment had grown too loud for her. But when the door opened, there she was, wrapped in a soft sweater, her hair still damp from a shower, eyes a little tired but kind. She gave me a small smile, not wide but real. She stepped back to let me in, and I noticed she'd put on the kettle. She didn't say good morning the way she usually did. She just said, "You came," and I nodded. We stood in the kitchen, the air thick with the scent of steeping tea, and something barely perceptible between us, tenderness, maybe, or hesitation. She reached for the flowers in my hands, her fingers brushing mine, and held them close to her face. "Ah, peonies," she murmured. "I haven't had these in years." She nodded again, quietly, like she was holding back words she hadn't figured out how to shape yet. We sat at the small table by the window, steam from our mugs curling in the space between us. For a while we just sipped, letting the tea settle and the silence stretch. Then, without looking at me, she spoke. "I woke up this morning wondering if maybe I imagined it. That maybe the kiss was something my heart needed so badly, it dreamed it into reality." I reached across the table and touched her hand lightly. "You didn't imagine it," I said, "and I haven't stopped thinking about it since." She finally looked up at me, her eyes wide and soft, and exhaled. "Good," she said. "Because I don't want it to feel like a mistake." I shook my head. It didn't. It doesn't. There was something vulnerable about the way she received that. Not like she doubted me, but like she didn't fully know how to let it in. Could see her fighting the habit of second-guessing, of assuming good things were temporary. To ease the weight of the moment, I suggested we go out for a walk. She hesitated, then nodded. We slipped into jackets and stepped outside, the chill in the air giving her an excuse to link her arm through mine. We walked the same route we had before, past familiar porches and hedges, past neighbors who pretended not to glance. But this time, it felt less like hiding and more like claiming something gently without announcement, but with presence. Halfway through our walk, we stopped at a bench near the park, and she sat with her hands in her lap. "I do." "You think this is foolish?" she asked, her voice not ashamed but uncertain. "Two people with scars pretending they can start from scratch?" Shook my head. "We're not starting from scratch," I told her. "We're starting from experience. From knowing what we don't want to lose again." She smiled faintly, then leaned into me, her shoulder pressing against mine. "I keep waiting for the part where this gets complicated," she said, "but it just feels ... soft." I told her maybe that was the point. Maybe love at this stage of life wasn't supposed to be fireworks or chaos. Maybe it was quiet, steady, warmth, the kind that grew rather than exploded. When we returned to her home, she asked if I'd stay for lunch. We made grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup, standing shoulder to shoulder in the kitchen, sharing laughter over how unevenly the bread toasted. It felt ordinary, but in a way that comforted rather than dulled. After we ate, we curled up on the couch once more, and I could feel her body relax completely against mine, like she had finally stopped holding herself in defense of what might go wrong at some point. She fell asleep with her head on my chest, and I didn't move. I just sat there, one arm wrapped around her shoulders, the other resting across her back. I listened to her breath and the ticking of the clock and the slow, steady sound of a home no longer filled with emptiness. I didn't need to say anything. I didn't need to be anywhere else. The truth was, I could have stayed like that forever. A few days passed with that same quiet rhythm: grocery runs, shared meals, long conversations that drifted between laughter and reflective pauses. It was as if we had created a small world just for ourselves, built not on grand gestures or declarations, but on the ordinary acts that quietly add up to something that feels a lot like love, the kind of love that doesn't rush to announce itself, but grows patiently, like a garden tended daily. Dolores seemed lighter, not in a dramatic way, but in the subtle lift of her shoulders. The softness in her laugh, the way she began to wear color again, blues and greens that complemented, the calm settling around her. I noticed she started humming when she moved through the kitchen, voice low and tuneless, but content. She'd begun pulling old recipes from drawers, trying them out again just because. One afternoon, I found her in the middle of baking a pie, her cheeks streaked with flour, her expression equal parts frustration and amusement. "I used to make these for my dad when I visited him," she said, as she tried to untangle a sticky crust from the rolling pin. "He always said my pie tasted like summer." I offered to help, and together we pieced it together, laughing at our clumsy attempts. It turned out a little crooked, the edges uneven. She said it was the best she'd made in years. We began to share more than just space. I told her about my mother's old garden, the way she'd talked to her roses like they were friends. Dolores told me about a road trip she'd once taken alone after her first heartbreak, where she ended up in a sleepy town by a lake and stayed for 2 months just to watch the sunrise every day. These pieces of ourselves, shared slowly and without pressure, became like roots intertwining beneath the surface. It's not visible, but undeniable. Still, there were things we hadn't said yet, things we danced around but hadn't quite faced. One afternoon, as we sat on the porch watching the wind rustle the tall grass along the fence line, she said, "What happens if this changes?" I looked at her, unsure what she meant. She clarified, "What happens when the newness wears off? When real life catches up?" It was a fair question. We'd built something warm, but we hadn't yet tested its durability. I told her I didn't have all the answers, but I knew I didn't want to disappear when things stopped being easy. I wasn't there just for the light parts. She looked relieved, but not entirely settled, and that was okay. Love, especially the kind that arrives later in life, often comes carrying old questions, and answering them takes time. We didn't need to solve it all that afternoon, just needed to keep choosing each other one small day at a time. That weekend, something new happened. Dolores invited me to join her for dinner at her friend Annette's place, her closest friend, and, as I'd learned, something of a gatekeeper when it came to Dolores's heart. She's protective, Dolores warned gently as we drove. She's seen me hurt a lot. Think she just wants to make sure I'm okay. I understood. And even though my palms were sweating slightly on the steering wheel, I knew this was important. Annette lived in a cozy bungalow just a few streets over. The moment she opened the door, I could feel her eyes scanning me, not unkindly, but with intent. She hugged Dolores tightly, then offered me a polite smile. We sat in her kitchen, the three of us, sipping iced tea as Dolores and Annette slipped into easy banter that only longtime friends share. Every now and then, Annette would look at me with a question behind her eyes. But she didn't ask anything directly until we'd finished dinner. Then, as she cleared the plates, she said casually, "So, what are your intentions?" Dolores groaned and covered her face. "Annette, really?" But I didn't mind. I respected it, actually. I looked Annette in the eye and said, "My intention is to be good to her, to not add more hurt to the years she's already had to carry, to show up and stay when it matters." There was a pause, and then Annette smiled, a small approving curl of the lips. Good answer, she said. And just like that, the wall lowered a little. On the drive back to her house, Dolores was quiet, staring out the window, her hands folded in her lap. You didn't have to say all that, she murmured. I smiled gently. I know, but I meant every word. She reached across the console and took my hand, lacing her fingers through mine. That was the first time she held my hand in public. Something about that simple gesture, the comfort in it, the certainty, meant more than any kiss. We pulled into her driveway as the sky began to darken, the horizon glowing amber behind the rooftops. She didn't invite me in right away. Instead, we stayed seated in the car, the air filled with the low hum of crickets and the scent of a neighbor's barbecue drifting on the breeze. She turned to me, her voice softer than usual. I don't know where this goes, but I want it. To keep going? I squeezed her hand, my thumb brushing over her knuckles. So do I said. And we'll figure it out day by day. She smiled, that same smile that had first cracked open something quiet in me, and leaned in to kiss me light, sure unhurried. Then she whispered, Don't go yet. And I didn't. Autumn crept in slowly, leaf by leaf, morning by morning, until the trees along Dolores' street burned gold and rust and cinnamon. The air turned crisper, our walks a little shorter, but no less meaningful. The warmth between us no longer relied on what was said or done. It had taken root. We had become part of each other's routines in a way that felt natural, not dramatic. There were no declarations, no sweeping moments of cinematic passion, just consistency, care, and a kind of devotion that could only come from choosing each other again and again in quiet, ordinary ways. One chilly Sunday morning, brought over groceries as usual, but this time I included a pair of fleece-lined slippers I saw in a shop window. They reminded me of her, soft, simple, a little weathered looking, but built to last. When I handed them to her, she laughed and tried them on immediately, shuffling around the kitchen floor like a kid trying on a costume. It made me laugh too deep, belly laughter that only came when the heart was completely unguarded. She looked up at me then and said, I've been alone for so long I forgot what it felt like to be seen like this. I told her that I hadn't felt truly seen in years. Either that maybe we hadn't just stumbled into each other. Maybe we'd been slowly walking toward this all along, without realizing it. We continued on like that for weeks, living our separate lives, but always circling back to one another. Still we had other delivery clients, still had errands and obligations, but every evening found me back at her place, sometimes for dinner, sometimes just for a warm drink and a quiet conversation, and sometimes just to sit beside her in silence. Didn't always have to be more than that. Love didn't need to declare itself loudly to be real then. One night in mid-October, we sat out on her back porch under a quilt, the stars faint behind drifting clouds. She leaned her head on my shoulder and asked, Do you think this is what people mean when they say something just feels right? I smiled and said, If it isn't, I don't want to know what is. We didn't speak much after that. Words felt too heavy, unnecessary. Everything we needed to say was already written into the air between us. As the year began to close, small changes settled into place. I gave up one of my outer city clients to free up more time in the afternoons. She cleared space in her spare room, not because we were rushing towards some official arrangement, but because we liked the idea of having space for each other without having to ask. One evening, she handed me a spare key, said nothing, and just waited. I took it without hesitation. Truth is, we never sat down to define what we were. There was no grand conversation, no label slapped onto the quiet miracle of our companionship. We simply became what we needed to become, day by day. And maybe that was the most honest way to grow something lasting, not in a rush of passion, but in a slow dance of mutual care. Some nights, when the wind rattled the window panes and the world felt distant and cold, I'd lie beside her on the couch, her head resting on my chest, her breath slow and steady. Thought about the first day I met her about the groceries I almost didn't deliver. The knock on the door that could have been just another job. It would have been so easy to miss her. So easy for both of us to remain too quiet. Invisible people moving past one another in parallel lines. But we hadn't. She once told me, "There's a certain kind of silence that only comes when someone makes you feel safe." I hadn't understood it then, not fully. But I do now. That silence had become my favorite sound. It said more than words ever could. And then came a night, just another unremarkable night. Nothing planned or anticipated, when she looked at me across the dinner table and said, "You know, you've become the best part of my day." I didn't need to respond. The look in my eyes told her I felt the same, maybe even more. In time, people began to notice. Her neighbors would wave a little longer when I parked outside. Her friend Annette began inviting us both over instead of just Dolores. Even my sister, who I rarely saw, remarked during a quick coffee run, "You seem different these days." Happier, and I was. I was happier, not in some overwhelming euphoric way, but in the grounded sense that I was where I was supposed to be, with who I was supposed to be with eventually. The world started calling again, other commitments, other routes, other responsibilities. But Dolores and I had already carved out a center that wouldn't be moved. She never asked me to stay, not directly. Every time I walked back through her door, she smiled like I had just returned home. And that was enough. I never stopped delivering groceries entirely. But somewhere along the way, it stopped being about the deliveries. It became about returning. It's about choosing to keep showing up, not for a job, not for duty, but for her. And every time I reached for the doorknob, before I stepped inside, I'd hear her voice in my head from that very first day, "Don't leave." I'm not joking. I never planned to. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.